There are moments in life when a single word or gesture can change everything. For Thomas, the quiet owner of a small, struggling store on the outskirts of town, that moment came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. A woman walked into his shop, dressed in designer clothes, her eyes scanning the shelves as if unsure of what she was looking for. But little did Thomas know, the encounter would alter both of their lives forever. What did he say to her, and how did it change everything? You won't believe what happened next. Thomas was a man of few words, a man who had built his life from the ground up, one brick at a time. His store, Thomas's Antiques and Oddities, was tucked away in a quiet corner of the town, often overlooked by passers-by. The once bustling town had seen better days, and so had the shop. Dust lingered on the shelves, and the wooden floor creaked beneath every step. But for Thomas, it was home. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the noise of the world and immerse himself in the small treasures that filled the space. He had inherited the shop from his father, a kind and hard-working man who had taught him the value of perseverance. But after his father's passing, Thomas struggled to keep the shop afloat. Sales were low, and the shop's once vibrant reputation had faded into the background. He had no family left, no one to share his troubles with, and every day it seemed the weight of the world was getting heavier. The shop was filled with relics of the past, old books, tarnished silverware, faded photographs, and intricate porcelain figurines. Each item had a story, and Thomas knew every one of them. Yet, despite the beauty of the items around him, he felt the sense of emptiness that often came with years of struggle. Then, on this particular afternoon, she walked in. Her name was Lily, and she was the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in the city. Her family owned several businesses and lived in a sprawling mansion on the hill. But for Lily, that world felt like a gilded cage. At 25, she had everything anyone could want: money, power, connections. But she was lonely. Surrounded by luxury, she felt disconnected from the world around her. There was a sense of emptiness in her life too, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Lily had been visiting the town with her father for business reasons, but she had never paid attention to the small shops hidden away from the main road. On a whim, she had decided to step into Thomas's shop, hoping for something different from the lavish dinners and endless meetings that filled her days. She wasn't expecting much, but there was something about the old, weathered store that intrigued her. As she walked through the creaky door, the faint smell of dust and age filled her nostrils. The shelves were cluttered with antiques, each item telling a silent story of its own. The dim light streaming in from the small window illuminated the dust particles that danced in the air, adding to the sense of history within the space. It was so different from the sterile, high-end boutiques she was used to. Lily hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the shelves, unsure of where to start. And then her gaze landed on Thomas. He was behind the counter, his face weathered with age, but his eyes held a depth of experience. There was something about him that seemed both comforting and distant at the same time. He was a man who had seen much, but who had also been through his own battles. Thomas noticed her gaze and looked up. His expression was neutral, almost distant. He had seen many customers come and go, but none had ever caught his attention like this. He could tell she was out of place, but he didn't know why. There was something about her that seemed both vulnerable and guarded. Lily's gaze lingered on a small wooden trinket near the counter, an intricately carved box that seemed to call out to her. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing the smooth surface of the wood. "That one," Thomas said, breaking the silence. His voice was low and rough, but there was an unexpected warmth in it. "It's a beautiful piece. Came from a collection of old family heirlooms." Lily looked up at him, surprised by his sudden words. It's lovely," she said softly, still examining the box in her hands. Thomas gave a small nod. It's got a lot of history. My father always used to say that every piece in here had a story to tell. It's a shame that the world's forgotten about the things that matter most. He paused, his gaze drifting to the shelves. But the real stories aren't in these objects. They're in the people who walk through the door. Lily met his eyes, startled by the depth of his words. It was a line she had never heard before in her world of high society, where everyone seemed too busy to care about real, meaningful connections. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The quiet between them felt comfortable, almost soothing. Then, with a slight smile, Thomas added, "You're not like the others. Most people come in here looking for something they can't have. They think money can solve everything, but not here, not in this shop." Lily was taken aback by his bluntness, but there was something oddly refreshing about it. In her world, people were always so careful with their words, always playing a game of pretense. Thomas had no such filter, and in that moment she found herself captivated by his sincerity. "Maybe I'm just looking for something different," Lily said, her voice tinged with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. "Something real." The days following Lily's first visit to Thomas's store were filled with an unspoken connection that neither of them could ignore. Lily found herself returning to Thomas's antiques and oddities again and again, each time under the pretense of browsing, but it was clear she wasn't just looking for items to buy. There was something about the shop, about Thomas himself, that intrigued her, something that spoke to her deeper than the glossy world she lived in. Thomas, for his part, remained cautious. He'd met wealthy people before, customers who had no interest in his store, only in the status of having an exclusive item or two. But Lily didn't act like them. She came in without the airs of entitlement that most of his customers carried, even though her clothes spoke of her wealth. She didn't seem to mind the dust on the shelves or the worn chairs in the corner, and she often lingered by the antique mirror near the back, her fingers tracing the edges of its ornate frame. It was as if she saw something in these objects, something beyond the price tag, something, perhaps, beyond herself. One afternoon, as she sat on one of the old leather chairs, flipping through a book of vintage postcards, Thomas found himself drawn to the sound of her quiet musings. She was reading aloud a postcard from 1923, written by a woman named Eleanor, who had traveled across Europe and sent her husband a message of love and longing. The words were simple, yet poignant. Thomas had never thought much about the postcards on his shelves, but hearing them through Lily's voice made him see them differently. "That's beautiful," she said, looking up from the card and meeting his eyes. "You know, it's strange. I don't even know why I keep coming back. I have everything I could ever want, but none of it feels like this." Her admission struck him. She had everything, and yet she didn't feel fulfilled. It was a sentiment Thomas could relate to more than he cared to admit. He had never been wealthy in the traditional sense, but he had learned early on that material possessions could only take you so far. His father had taught him that what mattered was not what you had, but what you did with it. But to hear Lily speak of it so openly, someone who lived in a mansion whose life seemed so full on the outside, made him question his own assumptions. He sat down across from her, his hands folded on his lap. "What is it that you're looking for, Lily?" he asked gently, his voice not probing but simply curious. "What is it you think this place offers?" Lily hesitated, looking down at the postcard, her fingers playing with the edges. "I don't know. Maybe it's the stories behind all of these things, the history, the way people lived back then." She glanced up at him. "Everything in my world is so fast, you know. I'm surrounded by people who only care about the next deal, the next event. My father's always telling me to smile, to network, to show up at this gala or that one. But none of it feels real. Thomas couldn't help but see the sadness behind her words, the frustration she hid so well behind her wealth and status. She was suffocated by the very things that were supposed to make her happy. As they continued talking, a strange camaraderie blossomed between them, one that felt raw and unfiltered. Lily would come in several times a week, and each time they would sit and talk about life, about loss, about the strange realities of their worlds. Emily had never expected to feel so understood by someone from a world so different from her own. But not all was as it seemed. Despite their growing connection, trouble began to brew just under the surface. Thomas had always been a man who preferred silence and solitude to drama and complications. But now, with Lily's increasing visits, a challenge was arising that he couldn't ignore. One afternoon, just as Thomas was tidying up a shelf of antique clocks, Lily entered the store, her face tight with something resembling anger. Her posture was stiff, and the usual warmth that accompanied her presence was absent. Thomas, noticing the change in her demeanor, looked up, concern etching his face. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice gentle but concerned. Lily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's my father. He's pressuring me to sell my stake in the company. He wants me to stop wasting time on this." She gestured vaguely at the shop, at the antiques, at the life she had started to create outside of her father's shadow. "He thinks I'm throwing my future away." Thomas looked at her with an understanding gaze, but his heart sank. He knew the pressure of family expectations all too well. But what troubled him more was the anger in Lily's eyes. She was no longer just frustrated. She was disillusioned with her world. "You can't be expected to live your life according to someone else's terms," he said quietly, the weight of his own life experiences coloring his words. Lily nodded, but her expression hardened. "It's not that simple, Thomas. My father is a force of nature. He's made me into what I am. If I don't do what he says, I'll lose everything, and I'm not just talking about money." Her words struck a nerve. Thomas had always prided himself on doing things his way, even if it meant struggling. But he could sense that Lily was being crushed under the weight of a legacy she hadn't asked for, a life she hadn't chosen. She wasn't just a pawn in her father's game. She was a woman suffocating in a world of expectation and control. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering his next words carefully. Finally, he spoke. "You've already got what you need, Lily. You just need to trust yourself, and maybe you'll find something more meaningful than the world you've been raised in." Lily looked at him, something shifting in her expression. It was as if she were hearing those words for the first time. They were simple, but they cut through the noise of her life. Perhaps she didn't have to follow the path her father had laid out for her. Maybe there was another way. Maybe she could create something entirely her own. But as quickly as that thought entered her mind, it was clouded by the phone call she received that very evening. Her father had arranged a meeting with the head of the company, demanding that she attend or risk losing her inheritance. The pressure was unbearable, and despite her newfound resolve, Lily found herself torn between loyalty to her family and the desire for a life of authenticity. In the days that followed, Lily became more distant. She stopped coming to the shop as frequently, her visits becoming fewer and farther between. Thomas sensed the shift, but he also understood that the pull of her father's world was far stronger than any connection she could form here. However, as the conflict between Lily's two worlds intensified, so did the bond between Thomas and Lily. Despite her departure from the shop, they both knew they were on a collision course, and when they finally confronted the truth, everything would change. The heavy hum of the city felt suffocating to Lily as she sat in the plush office of her father's company. The towering glass walls around her showed the world outside, but nothing inside the room gave her the comfort she longed for. It was a strange feeling, a dissonance between the life she was expected to lead and the life she wanted for herself. Her father, Jonathan Harrow, sat at the head of the long conference table, his fingers steepled as he waited for her response. He was a man of immense power and wealth, known for his unyielding control over everything and everyone in his orbit. "I don't understand why you're still fighting me on this, Lily," Jonathan said, his voice smooth, but there was an edge to it. "You're not a child anymore. You have responsibilities to the family and the company." Lily could feel the familiar weight of his expectations pressing down on her chest. She had been in this room too many times, seated across from him as he tried to convince her of what she needed in her life, what she owed the family, and every time she had given in. But today something was different. "I'm not a child," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside. "I've built my own life, Dad, and I'm not going to let you dictate every single decision I make anymore. I can't do this." Her father's expression darkened, his patience wearing thin. "You have a duty, Lily. To me, to the company. This isn't just about you anymore. We are talking about the future of the Harrow legacy." But in Lily's heart, the fight was already over. She had made her decision. She had spent weeks living in the tension between her father's world and the authenticity she had discovered in her brief moments with Thomas, the quiet man in his store who seemed to understand her in ways no one else had. She had seen the quiet strength in him, his simple life built on values she had once known, but lost in the chaos of wealth and expectation. And now, at this very moment, she knew what she had to do. Lily stood up, her voice firm now, cutting through the air with a finality that took both her father and the board members by surprise. "I'm leaving. I'm not going to be a pawn in your game anymore," she declared. Her hands trembled, but she didn't falter. "I'm done." Her father's jaw clenched as the tension in the room surged. "You're making a huge mistake, Lily. You think you can just walk away from everything we've built? You'll lose everything, including your inheritance." She could see the anger in his eyes, the familiar threat of financial ruin hanging in the air, but she no longer felt afraid. Something had shifted in her realization that life wasn't about the money, the power, the mansion on the hill. It was about freedom, choice, and the courage to follow her own heart. Her heart was no longer in the corporate world, not in her father's world, and especially not in the suffocating life he had mapped out for her. "I don't need your money," Lily replied, turning on her heel and walking out of the room with a sense of finality she had never known before. The decision was made, but even as she left the boardroom, the weight of her departure felt heavy. She knew her father would do everything in his power to drag her back into the fold. Still, she felt a sense of liberation. There was no going back now. 2 days later, Thomas received an unexpected phone call. The bell above his store's door rang as he set down his polishing cloth, but this time it wasn't the sound of a casual visitor. His gaze shifted to the door, expecting the usual flow of customers, but instead, standing there in the doorway was Lily, looking out of place in her formal attire, her hair still styled, her posture stiff with the tension of the world she had just stepped out of. Thomas straightened up, surprised to see her back so soon, and even more surprised by the disheveled look in her eyes. She walked into the store without saying a word, her steps slow and deliberate, as if every inch forward required a monumental effort. Her usual confident demeanor had been replaced by a quiet, almost fragile vulnerability. "Lily, what happened?" Thomas asked, concern evident in his voice. It was rare to see her like this, so unlike the woman who had strolled in so casually a week ago. She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with emotion. For a moment, she couldn't speak, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She had taken a leap that felt exhilarating in the moment, but terrifying in its aftermath. "I did it," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "I told him I'm done. I walked away." Thomas watched her with quiet understanding. He knew the battle she had fought, the courage it had taken to stand up to the world that had shaped her. But he also knew that the hardest part was yet to come. "That's a huge decision," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers. "But it's yours to make. No one can take that away from you." Lily nodded, but the doubt lingered. "But now what?" she asked. "Now that I've left everything behind, I don't even know who I am anymore. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I feel empty." Thomas smiled gently, stepping forward. "It's okay to feel that way. You've just taken a big step, and it's going to take time to figure things out. But I can tell you one thing. You're not empty. You're just finding a new path." Lily's eyes softened as she met his gaze, feeling the comfort of his words. "I've never felt like this before," she whispered. "I thought if I just followed the path, I'd be happy. But now that I'm out, I don't know what comes next." For a long moment, there was silence between them. The store was quiet, the air filled with the soft rustle of old books and the scent of antiques. And then, without warning, Lily stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Thomas. It wasn't an embrace of passion, but of solace. She needed someone to believe in her, and in this moment, she trusted him. Meanwhile, back at the company, Jonathan Harrow was incensed. His daughter's defection was not just a personal affront, it was an attack on his empire. He had spent years building this business and shaping her into the successor he envisioned. How dare she throw it all away for a simple life? In a fit of rage, he dispatched a team of lawyers to Lily, threatening to cut her off completely. He would revoke her inheritance, sever all ties, and leave her with nothing. But the more Lily stood in Thomas's store, feeling grounded by his calm presence, the more she realized her decision was the right one. Jonathan's threats felt small and petty compared to the freedom she was slowly learning to embrace. It wasn't long before Thomas realized that this was more than just a personal victory for Lily, it was a public one. When news of her defection began to spread, it became a media storm. Headlines screamed about the billionaire's daughter rejecting her inheritance, her wealth, and her life for something simpler. The media wanted to know why, but Thomas knew that the answer was much deeper than any headline could capture. The emotional stakes had reached their peak. Lily's defection from her father's world had come with a cost: loneliness, loss, uncertainty. But the more she found herself surrounded by people who cared, like Thomas, the clearer it became that her new path had its own rewards. Thomas had become a symbol of the strength it took to break away from a suffocating world to create something real. And for Lily, that moment of clarity, standing in that dusty store with her arms wrapped around a man who saw her for who she truly was, would mark the beginning of her transformation. But the story didn't end there. The twists of fate had just begun, and Lily's decision to walk away from her father's empire would set off a chain of events neither she nor Thomas could have predicted. Months passed since Lily had walked away from the world her father had created for her. Life, as expected, wasn't easy. The media's fascination with her decision to leave her billion-dollar inheritance had subsided, but the fallout from her father's threats was still ever present. The once lavish lifestyle she had known, the glittering events, and the company she had once been the heir to, all of it was gone. But so was the suffocating weight of expectations that had once defined her. Lily found herself at peace, though not without sacrifice. She moved into a small apartment, one that lacked the extravagance of her former home, but was filled with something far more valuable: freedom. She began to rebuild, step by step, carving out a new life for herself, free of her father's chains. She took on a simple job at a local cafe to support herself, working with people who didn't care about her last name, only her kindness and hard work. It was grounding in ways she hadn't imagined. But it wasn't just the daily routine that kept her going. It was Thomas. Over the months, their bond deepened. He became her quiet anchor in a world that felt unsteady. He listened to her fears and frustrations and supported her when she doubted herself. Slowly, she began to understand that happiness wasn't something to be bought or inherited. It was something to be nurtured in the simple, everyday moments. It was in the quiet exchanges of a morning coffee, the laughter of new friends, and in the satisfaction of building something on her own terms. Lily didn't need her father's wealth to be successful. What she needed was peace of mind, the ability to sleep at night knowing she was true to herself. She realized that the riches her father had promised her were hollow if they came at the expense of her happiness. She had spent years chasing after material wealth, but it had only left her empty. Now, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known before, and with each passing day, she grew more confident in her new life. As for Thomas, the transformation in Lily had also transformed him. His store, once a quiet haven of antiques and oddities, became a symbol of what it meant to live authentically. More and more people came through the door, not just for the items, but for the stories. Thomas had unknowingly become a mentor to many, offering a place for people to slow down, reflect, and reconnect with their true selves. Lily, now actively involved in the store, helped Thomas organize local events, bringing the community together through the appreciation of history, artifacts, and stories. It was her way of giving back to the place that had given her so much more than any luxury could. Thomas never asked for anything in return, but he knew she had found what she was searching for. One afternoon, as they stood behind the counter, watching the sun set over the city, Lily turned to Thomas with a smile that spoke volumes of the transformation within her. "You were right," she said quietly. "It's not about what we have, it's about what we give." Thomas, with his usual calm demeanor, nodded. "Exactly," he replied, his eyes warm with understanding. "True wealth is in the lives we touch, the kindness we offer, and the legacy we leave in our wake." And with that, Lily understood. The past was behind her, but the future was full of possibilities. She had walked into Thomas's store as a woman trapped by her father's expectations, but now she was free. Free to choose, free to live, and free to define her own path. The story of Lily and Thomas, two unlikely souls who found each other when life seemed lost, was more than a tale of love or success. It was a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things in life are the ones that can't be bought. They're the ones we build for ourselves. And as Lily had learned, true freedom is found not in what you inherit, but in what you choose to give away. As the store doors closed for the night, Thomas and Lily shared a quiet moment of contentment, knowing that the best was yet to come. And for Lily, this was just the beginning.